Hi everybody, it's Courtney, and I am very excited to be celebrating Maria's 100 subscriber hop. So today I'm going to be using the Peony Perfection stamp as well as the Inward Elements stencil, both by MFT, and these are part of the newest release. So I'm going to start off with my mini Misty here. I went ahead and took that foam pad out because this large floral is a red rubber stamp. I'm going to go ahead and line that up onto a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. And I stamped this out with Fade Out ink by Ink on 3, which is great for no-line coloring. It kind of disappears as you stamp. Now, I really only have to stamp this once to get a really great impression, enough for me to see, but I did stamp this 3 times just so that it's easier for you guys to see, especially after I do my ink blending. We'll kind of lose some of those lines. So I also took a piece of Simon Says Stamp masking paper, and I stamped out the floral again. This time I just switched over to some black ink just so it's a little bit easier for me to see when I do my fussy cutting. Now, if you were to cut a mask for this particular image, I would definitely cut it into 2 separate pieces because these leaves are pretty intricate. So it did take me a few minutes, and it doesn't have to be perfect. That's the thing with no line coloring. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's scary and it looks harder than it actually is, but it's actually way more forgiving. So once my mask was cut out, I went ahead and lined that up right along that image. And again, it was a little difficult to line up, but it doesn't have to be perfect because those lines are going to disappear. We're not going to have that white outline that we sometimes get with ink blending and masking because the lines are going to disappear. So once I lined that up the best I possibly could anyway, we're going to move on to the ink blended background, and I'm going to be using some of Simon Hurley Create inks. These are a dye ink. I guess you could say if I had to pick an ink they're most similar to, it would be the regular Distress inks, but I find that these blend better. You don't get those harsh lines that you sometimes get with regular Distress inks, and they're perfect for stamping, which Distress inks aren't. So I guess they're Distress inks on steroids. So I started off with my darkest color, which is, well, I guess it's not my darkest color, but it's more of a blue-green, like a teal. It's Tropical Mango. And I'm just putting this around the outside, and this is just to kind of guide me as far as where my colors need to be. So I moved on to the lightest blue. And again, just adding a little bit around the image just to guide myself. I'm going in with a very light hand, but for this technique, you're really going to want to saturate the paper. So I'm just starting off with a light hand here just to get my placement of what colors I want where. And you can see that I'm even starting off on the mask so that I don't get too heavy-handed right away. So once that's done, I can add this medium blue, I guess you could call it, and I'll have all the colors linked in the description box below. And this is just going to go basically in between the Tropical Tango and I want to say that it's Blue Skies. I'm totally drawing a blank on the colors, but like I said, I'll link them below. Again, going in with a very light hand just to get my placement. Once I'm happy with the placement, I'm going to go in reverse. I'm going to go back in with that Tropical Tango and darken up those edges and the corners. I want this to be the furthest away from the image so that it's going to look as if I kind of have a highlight around my image itself. So here's where I'm going in with a pretty heavy hand, and I'm going over certain areas multiple times because you really want to saturate this paper for this technique. You don't want to go in with too light of a hand because the next step is not really going to work as well. So next I'm going in with that medium blue, and I'm just going to blend out this Tropical Tango, and then finally I will finish off with the lighter blue and just fill in, I guess you could call it the highlight area around the image itself, and these colors blend beautifully together. So once all of my ink blending was done, I did give it maybe a minute or two just to kind of let it set into the paper because I added so much ink. It's kind of just sitting on top right now. So maybe just 1 or 2 minutes. And then we're going to move on to the stencil. So I lined that up directly in the center, and I still have my mask in place. I'm going to use some Post-it note tape and just add that to all 4 sides just so that my stencil doesn't shift around. You can use pixie spray, but being my ink is still wet, it probably wouldn't have stuck too well. Now you can use water for this, but I'm going to use some shimmer spray. And my shimmer spray is shot because I dumped it accidentally in a video not too long ago, but I'm not going to throw it away because it's still shimmery. It just doesn't work exactly the same as it did before. I'm going to spray a bunch of this onto an acrylic block, and then I'm going to take another blending brush and pick some of that moisture up, some of that shimmer spray up, and I'm just going to go in the direction of the stencil. Now I'm not going in, I started with a circular motion and realized that's not going to work too well. So being these are kind of straight lines on this stencil, I'm going to go right in the same direction as these lines so that my stencil doesn't shift around. Remember, we only have the 4 sides taped down and not the actual pattern of the stencil. So I went around that entire panel, I guess you could say, and I just lifted the corner to see what kind of reaction I was getting, and it was there. I could certainly see, but I wanted it to be even bolder. So I added a little bit more of the shimmer spray to my acrylic block and went around the entire panel again. Now, you don't want to add too much moisture here. So if you're using water, just regular water, you want to make sure that you're going in with a really light hand and your brush isn't saturated. With the shimmer spray, you're not going to get the same exact results because it's not actually water. But you can see it leaves that nice pattern, and I have a ton of shimmer. So I let this dry for about a half an hour because I want my mask to be dry before I remove it. And you can see that it was pretty saturated and it's tearing a lot as I'm removing it. I'm using the tip of my scissors to kind of guide me. And if your mask starts to tear, let it tear. Don't try to save the mask. We want to try to save the card. So if it starts to tear, leave it and come back to it a few minutes later and let it completely dry. When the sticky part of the mask gets wet, it becomes very tacky, almost like a dried glue, which is basically, I guess, what it is. So it will kind of leave a residue in some areas. So just let it dry and you can kind of rub it off with your fingers. So be careful, but if the mask rips, let the mask rip. Otherwise, you're going to rip your card panel, and you don't want that to happen. So once that was finally removed, we're going to move on to the Copic coloring. I am not going to show you all of it. I'm just going to show you a little bit. But as most of you know, for the Copic colorists out there, I own Copics. I own Copics, but I don't own the company. They are switching over to different refills. And due to the pandemic, I believe they are delayed. And we can't get any refills anywhere. So I am running low on a lot of colors and I have no way to refill them. So I am going to use an R combination that I don't typically use for a pink. And you'll see that my darkest color is a R24, which is actually a red, but I'm not getting a whole lot of contrast. And this is just because I'm very limited as far as the colors that I can use. But I like to see more contrast. So in order to kind of deepen up my shadows, I'm going to bring in some colored pencils. And I have the Polychromos, and that was super quick when I showed you that color. I'm sorry about that, but I'll link that below as well. And I'm only using 2 here. I'm going in with a very, very light hand just to deepen out the shadows. When I go in with the lighter color of the colored pencil, I blend out the red, and then I kind of get lighter and lighter with the amount of pressure I'm adding to the paper until the tip of the pencil is no longer touching. And that's how you're going to get a nice gradient, and you're not going to see exactly where you left off with that pencil. So I'm going to show you just a few petals here. Whenever I'm doing no line coloring, I like to work with just 1 or 2 petals at a time. That way I can kind of keep track of the shape of each petal. Now, the peony in general, in nature, they kind of have petals that go in every single direction. Some are folded, some are shooting out from the center, some are shooting out from the sides. So these are going to have different shadows. The shadows are going to be in different places for each petal. So it's kind of important to kind of keep track of it. That's why it's easiest just to work with 1 or 2 petals at a time. Also, being we stamped with a fade out ink, which is a very, very light ink, sometimes it's helpful to stamp out with a darker ink, like a black ink, onto a scrap piece of paper so that you can use that as a reference. Being this is a red rubber stamp, there was no packaging that went along with it as far as the acetate with the image on it. So I usually use that as a guide. But in this case, I just stamped it on some scrap piece of paper just to use it as a guide so that I don't lose track of my petals. So I'm doing the same thing here. I start off with my lightest color, which is the R20. Then I go in with the R24 to add my shadow areas, which is basically going to be on the base of the petals. And if it is folded over on itself, where it is folded over, that's also going to create a shadow. Blended that out with the R22, R21, and then finished with the R20 again that we started with. And then again, brought in those two colored pencils just to deepen up those shadows. Now I know the flower and whole is going to look pink even though I am using a red. That's basically my scary dark. You want to make sure that you're using a color that's significantly darker than what your image actually is, and that's how you're going to get your contrast. So I went ahead and finished up the flower, and I pretty much used the same technique for the entire thing, and we're going to move on to the stem and the leaves. Now I did leave all of this in because it was fairly quick. I'm going directly in with my darkest color because I'm not using pencils here, and I want to kind of maintain the flick lines that I'm going to create, and this is going to add some texture to especially the leaves. Some of the leaves, or one of the leaves actually, I'm just adding a little bit of shading to the base. Two of the leaves, I'm going to add some shading to the top and the bottom, and that's going to give the leaf some shape, like it's kind of bent or bowed out a little bit. That one leaf is folded over on itself, so I made sure that I added a little bit of a shadow where it is folded over. Next, I'm going to move on to the G94, and I'm just going to extend these areas out a little bit further. You can see I also added a little bit of shading where the stem, I guess one stem is meeting the main stem, if that makes sense, just so that I can have a little bit of differentiation there. I didn't really think about where to add shadows, and sometimes you don't need to think. Don't overthink. Just add shadows. It doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't have to be exact, just as long as you have the contrast and you can kind of differentiate between one petal and the next, or one part of the stem and the next. So moved on to the G43, and you can see that I'm leaving just a teeny tiny bit of a highlight area for the G20, which is a really, really light green. So you want to be careful that you don't go over your darkest areas with this color, or else it's going to act as a colorless blender and just kind of move that color around. So once my coloring was complete, I went ahead and die cut this panel with a diagonal stitched rectangle die, also by MFT, and it's just a little bit smaller than an A2 size card, and I really never have too much of a plan for my cards, so I kind of played around with how I wanted to add my sentiment. I ended up taking the congrats sentiment from the All the Encouragement stamp set, taking another piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, treated that with my anti-static tool, stamped out the sentiment with some Versamark ink, and sprinkled on some white embossing powder and heat set that. Now I didn't bother to heat up my heat gun ahead of time, figuring I'm only heat setting a sentiment, but I should have, because next we're going to add some ink blending over it. I'm going to use the same three colors as I used in the background so that I get a little bit of a tone on tone look. So nothing special here. It's basically just emboss resist, and you don't have to do it this way. You can do your ink blending first and then add your sentiment, but you'll have to wait for your ink to dry. And I'm not the most patient person in the world, so I prefer just to do the resist technique, and that way I don't have to wait for my inks to dry. You do want to make sure that you take a towel or a paper towel to rub over that sentiment and get rid of any of the ink that's kind of sitting on top of it. Once that's done, I went ahead and cut this down into a strip just a little bit larger than the sentiment itself, and I could adhere everything together. And I'm sorry, I forgot to zoom out again. I've been doing that a lot lately, so we're super close here. And ignore my nails too, because I have been doing my own nails and I've been experimenting with things. This is the first time I've used the dip powder, and I watched videos on it and I've gotten it done at the salon. It's not as easy as it looks. So they're a little lumpy, but it is what it is. I didn't go to the salon. So I adhered my main panel to the card base with some Tampomato multi-glue and took some foam tape to add my sentiment to the lower left-hand corner, and finished off with some white Blizzard Nuvo drops just to add a little bit more shimmer to the background, as if we didn't already have enough. But huge congratulations to Maria for hitting her 100 subscriber milestone. I will leave all of the information on the hop as well as the giveaways. There are giveaways in the description box along with the supplies used in today's card. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.